Before asphalt, before gravel, before concrete, there was wood. In the 1800s, when America needed to cross a swamp, they didn't drain it. They didn't go around it. They laid logs, thousands of them, side by side sunk into the mud, forming a road surface that could carry a loaded wagon across ground that would swallow a horse up to its belly. They called them corduroy roads. They were brutal to ride, brutal to build, and they stretched across some of the most impassable terrain in North America. But these primitive wooden highways did something remarkable. They opened the frontier. They moved armies. They connected settlements that would have otherwise remained isolated for decades, and the men who built them paid a price we've almost entirely forgotten. This is the story of America's log roads, the technology that allowed a young nation to cross terrain that should have been impossible, the workers who laid them, the toll they took on horses and human bodies, and why, for nearly 2 centuries, wood was the only thing standing between civilization and the swamp. Section 1. America's Impassable Ground. Frustration. Stand at the edge of the Great Dismal Swamp in 1800. 30 miles of black water, cypress knees jutting from mud that has no bottom, and a canopy so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground. This isn't a park. This isn't a curiosity. This is a barrier, and it's everywhere. From the pine barrens of New Jersey to the cypress swamps of Louisiana, from the bogs of Michigan to the tidewater marshes of the Carolinas, early America was defined as much by what you couldn't cross as by what you could. The maps showed roads, but the reality on the ground was different. A road might exist in summer, firm enough for a man on foot. Come spring, that same road would be 5 feet of standing water with a current strong enough to pull a horse under. Eastern forests presented their own challenge. Ancient growth, trees 6 feet across, roots that had been growing for 300 years, interlocking into a mat that was nearly impossible to clear. Between the trees, the ground stayed wet. Water had nowhere to go. The forest floor was sponge. Wagons sank, not slowly, not with warning. A freight wagon carrying a family's possessions, or a merchant's goods, or a mill's grain would roll across what looked like solid ground, and the front axle would drop 4 feet into mud in the span of a second. The horses would lunge, the wagon would tip, and if you were lucky, or you'd only lose the cargo. If you were unlucky, you'd lose the horses. They'd panic, thrash, and drown in mud while still in their harnesses. Southern swamps were worse. In the lowlands of Georgia, South Carolina, and eastern North Carolina, there were places where the concept of dry land didn't exist for 6 months of the year. The Okefenokee, the Atchafalaya, the Congaree. These weren't obstacles you could go around. They were 50, 60, 80 miles across. You either crossed them or you didn't go. Travelers wrote about it with a mix of awe and disgust. A journey from Charleston to Savannah, less than 100 miles, could take a week. Not because of distance, because of ground. You'd make 10 miles in a day, then spend the next day digging your wagon out of a sinkhole that opened up overnight where the road used to be. The merchant routes were the worst. You needed to move goods between cities to make money. But the roads between those cities went through swamps. A tobacco merchant in Richmond trying to get his crop to Norfolk had to cross the Great Dismal. There was no road around it. You either went through or your tobacco rotted in the warehouse. Horses died, frequently. A horse could pull a wagon across firm ground all day without issue. Put that same horse in a swamp crossing, mud up to its chest, pulling against suction with every step, and it would be dead in an hour. Heart failure, exhaustion, drowning. There are accounts from the 1780s of entire pack trains, 20 or 30 horses, lost in a single crossing attempt. The horses would be cut from their loads and left to die because there was no way to pull them out. The economic cost was staggering. Goods couldn't move. A farmer in inland Virginia might grow enough tobacco to make a profit, but if he couldn't get it to a port, it was worthless. A mill could process grain, but if the road washed out every spring, there was no point in building the mill in the first place. Settlements stayed small because settlers couldn't get in. Trade stayed local because merchants couldn't get through. There were roads that killed. The Wilderness Road through the Cumberland Gap was passable technically, but it claimed lives every year. Not from bandits, from the road itself. Sections of it went through wetlands that would shift depending on rainfall. A trail that was safe in July could be a death trap in October. Families would attempt the crossing, lose their wagon, lose their animals, and turn back. Or they wouldn't turn back. There are graves along that route that were never marked because the bodies were never recovered from the mud. And this wasn't the frontier edge. This was the eastern seaboard. This was the civilized part of the country. The parts where people had been living for 150 years. If you couldn't reliably travel between Richmond and Norfolk, how are you supposed to open the interior? The problem extended beyond the south. In the Midwest, the prairies looked flat and easy from a distance. But between the patches of dry ground were marshes, bogs, and seasonal wetlands that turned the entire region into a quagmire for half the year. Michigan, Wisconsin, and Illinois were riddled with wetlands. Travel between settlements could be just as difficult as in the coastal swamps. In New York, the path between Albany and Buffalo went through the Montezuma Marshes, a sprawling wetland at the north end of Cayuga Lake. Before the Erie Canal, travelers had to cross it on foot or horseback, picking their way across semi-solid ground, hoping they didn't step into a sinkhole. Wagons couldn't make it. You had to unload everything, carry it across on your back, and hope your horse made it through alive. The military faced the same problem. During the Revolutionary War, moving troops and artillery across New Jersey's Pine Barrens was nearly impossible. The British found this out the hard way during the retreat from Philadelphia. They had to abandon guns because the wagons sank and couldn't be pulled free. By the time they reached New York, they'd lost more equipment to mud than to enemy action. You needed a solution. And the solution turned out to be trees. If you're watching this because you're interested in how America actually got built, hit subscribe. I cover the forgotten infrastructure, the lost trades, and the workers who built the country we take for granted. Section 2. Building a road from trees, wonder. The idea is almost absurd. You're standing in a swamp, water up to your knees, mud that has no bottom, and your solution is to cut down trees, lay them side by side across the mud, and call it a road. But it worked. The technique was old. Europeans had been using log roads for centuries in peat bogs and wetlands where nothing else would hold. The Romans did it. Medieval traders in the Netherlands did it. Prehistoric people in England built wooden trackways across marshes 4,000 years ago, and some of those trackways are still there, preserved in the peat. But in America, it became something else. It became the primary method of crossing impassable ground for nearly 200 years. Here's how they built one. First, you survey the route. This isn't a guess. You need to know where the firmest ground is, where the water is shallowest, where the route can connect to solid ground on both ends. A bad route means the road fails in the first season. A good route means it lasts 5, maybe 8 years before it needs to be rebuilt. The surveyors would walk the swamp, sometimes for weeks, probing the ground with poles, marking trees, taking notes. They'd look for places where the water flowed, because flowing water meant there was a channel, and a channel meant there might be harder ground underneath. They'd avoid still water, because still water meant deep mud. Then you start felling trees. Not just any trees. You need straight trunks, uniform diameter, 12 to 15 feet long depending on the width of the road. The best wood was pine or cedar because it resisted rot. Oak worked, but was heavier and harder to move. Chestnut worked until the blight killed them all. Cypress was ideal in the south because it was lightweight, rot-resistant, and grew directly in the swamps where you needed it. You'd fell a tree, limb it, section it, and drag it to the roadbed. If you were working in a swamp with standing water, you'd float the logs to the construction site. If the ground was too soft to support oxen, you'd use human labor. Teams of men would drag logs using ropes, sometimes wading through water up to their chests. Dozens of men. Axes, saws, teams of oxen. You'd work a section of forest until you had enough logs to cover a quarter-mile of road, then you'd move to the next section. The logs were laid perpendicular to the direction of travel, side by side, touching, like the ribs of corduroy fabric. That's where the name came from. When you looked at the road from the side, it looked like ribbed cloth. The name stuck. Corduroy Road, Whale Road, Log Road, Pole Road. Different regions use different terms. but the construction was the same. Each log was 10 to 14 inches in diameter. You laid them directly onto the mud or onto a base of smaller branches if the ground was especially soft. No foundation, no gravel, just wood on mud. The weight of the logs, combined with the compression from traffic, would press them into the surface and create a semi-stable platform. In soft ground, the logs would sink. That was expected. You'd lay them, and they'd settle 6 inches, a foot, sometimes 2 feet into the mud before they hit resistance. Once they settled, they'd hold. Usually. Sometimes the ground was so soft that the logs would keep sinking. In those cases, you'd lay a second course of logs perpendicular to the first, creating a cross-hatched foundation. Then you'd lay a third course on top, running parallel to the direction of travel. It added time and cost, but it worked. If the swamp was deep, you'd build in layers. First layer sinks, second layer goes on top. In some locations, especially in the Carolinas and Louisiana, there are roads where they laid 3 or 4 layers of logs over the course of a decade, each layer sinking, each layer being covered by the next. Archaeologists have found sections of corduroy road buried 8 feet underground, perfectly preserved in anaerobic mud. After the logs were laid, you'd cover them with dirt or sand if you had it. This served 2 purposes. First, it filled the gaps between the logs and created a smoother surface. Second, it protected the wood from direct exposure to sun and rain, which slowed rot. A dirt-covered corduroy road could last twice as long as an uncovered one. But you didn't always have dirt. In deep swamps, there was nothing to cover the logs with. The only dry material was the logs themselves. So you rode directly on wood. Every rut, every gap between logs, every place where a log had rotted through, you felt it. A skilled crew could lay a quarter-mile of road in a week. That's assuming they had the logs already cut. Some the route already cleared and the weather cooperated. If they were cutting as they went, the pace dropped to maybe 100 yards a week. The math is staggering. A 12-foot wide road, quarter-mile long, required around 800 logs. A mile required over 3,000. To build a 10-mile road, you'd need to fell, trim, section, and place 30,000 trees. In practice, you'd need more, because logs would break, rot, or be rejected for being too crooked or too small. They did it. The cost varied depending on location and labor. In the 1820s, a corduroy road through a North Carolina swamp cost around $2,000 per mile. That's roughly $75,000 in modern money. Expensive, but far cheaper than trying to drain the swamp or build a raised stone road. And in many cases, it was the only option that worked. Some roads were built by local governments, some were built by private companies, and some were built by the military, which needed to move troops and artillery across terrain that would otherwise be impassable. The labor was brutal. You're working in a swamp. Mosquitoes, snakes, alligators in the south. The water is stagnant, which means disease. Malaria, dysentery, typhoid. There are accounts of road crews losing a third of their workers to fever before the road was finished. You're standing in water all day. Your feet never dry. Infections were common. A small cut would become infected, and in a week, you'd lose the limb. There were no antibiotics, no clean water, no way to stay dry. You worked, you got sick, and you either recovered or you didn't. In the winter, it was worse in some ways. The water was cold enough to cause hypothermia, but you still had to work in it. Your hands would go numb. You'd lose feeling in your feet. Men would finish a day's work, sit down, and not be able to stand back up because their legs had stopped working. But corduroy roads were just the beginning. In the 1840s, a new type of wooden road appeared, the plank road. Instead of laying round logs perpendicular to travel, you'd saw logs into flat planks, 8 to 12 feet long, and lay them lengthwise. The planks would be placed side by side, creating a smooth, flat surface. The result was a road you could travel at speed. Plank roads were a revolution. For about 5 years, they were everywhere: New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan. Investors poured money into plank road companies. They built hundreds of miles of them. Some were toll roads. You'd pay a few cents per wagon to use them, and the company would maintain the road and collect profit. The problem was that plank roads rotted faster than corduroy roads. Flat planks, exposed to rain and sun, would rot through in 3 to 5 years. The planks would split, warp, and break. Nails would pull out. Horses would step through broken planks and break their legs. Wagons would hit gaps and shatter wheels. Corduroy roads, especially those covered in dirt, could last 8 to 10 years. Plank roads couldn't. The maintenance costs were higher than the toll revenue. Plank road companies went bankrupt when their roads fell apart faster than they could collect tolls to rebuild them. By the 1850s, the plank road boom was over. Corduroy roads, slower and rougher, remained the standard for swamp crossings. And then came the war. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next video, where I break down how Civil War armies built miles of these roads in days, often under fire. Section 3, Civil War Corduroy, Urgency. When the Civil War started, both armies immediately realized they had a problem. You can't move artillery through a swamp. You can't supply an army if your wagons are sinking into mud. And the South was full of swamps, so they built roads, fast. The Union and Confederate armies both had engineering corps whose primary job was road construction. Not fortifications, not bridges. Roads. Because without roads, you couldn't fight. An army without supply lines was an army that starved, and supply lines required roads. In Virginia, the mud was legendary. The Peninsula Campaign of 1862 was fought as much against the ground as against the enemy. Union forces moving toward Richmond had to cross miles of tidal marsh, cypress swamp, and bottomland that turned to soup with every rain. They built corduroy roads as they advanced, logs laid directly into the mud, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes under fire. A Wisconsin infantry regiment recorded laying 2 miles of corduroy road in a single day while skirmishers held off Confederate cavalry a half-mile ahead. The men would cut trees, drag logs, lay them, and move forward. The wagons and artillery would follow. When the shooting started, the road crew would drop their axes, pick up rifles, and fight. When the shooting stopped, they'd go back to building road. In the South, Confederate forces did the same. The Wilderness, a dense forest in central Virginia, had almost no real roads, just trails. When Lee's army needed to move through it in 1864, they built miles of corduroy road in a matter of days. Logs laid through underbrush so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. The roads were rough, barely wide enough for a single wagon, but they worked. One Confederate engineer, Captain James Stevenson, wrote about building a corduroy road across a section of the Chickahominy Swamp while under artillery fire. The Union guns couldn't see them because of the tree cover, but they knew roughly where the road was being built. Shells would land in the swamp, explode in the mud, and send water and debris 50 feet in the air. Men kept working. If they stopped, the army couldn't move. If the army couldn't move, they'd be surrounded and destroyed. The scale of construction was enormous. In the Atlanta Campaign of 1864, Sherman's army built an estimated 50 miles of corduroy road across northern Georgia. Some of it was new construction. Some of it was repair of existing roads that had been torn up by Confederate forces trying to slow the Union advance. There are records of entire brigades, thousands of men being temporarily reassigned to road construction. An infantry unit would march into a swamp in the morning, spend the day cutting and laying logs, then march out in the evening and camp on the road they just built. The next day, wagons and artillery would use that road to catch up to the front. The roads didn't last long. They didn't need to. A Civil War corduroy road only had to hold together long enough for the army to pass. After that, it could rot. Many of them did. There are sections of Virginia and Georgia where you can still find the remnants of these roads, buried in swamps, logs rotted down to black stumps, but still in their original parallel alignment. Some roads were built under fire. The Battle of the Wilderness in 1864 saw corduroy roads used not just for logistics, but for tactical movement. Units would advance along a log road, deploy into the woods on either side, fight, then fall back to the road to regroup. The roads became defensive lines. If you controlled the road, you controlled movement through that section of forest. One Union officer, Captain John DeForest, wrote about trying to move artillery across a half-finished corduroy road while Confederate sharpshooters fired from the tree line 100 yards away. The horses kept getting shot. The men would cut the dead horses out of the harness, drag them to the side, and hitch new horses. The guns kept moving. The road kept getting built. If they stopped, the battery would be overrun. The Confederacy built roads in swamps that the Union didn't even know existed. There's a corduroy road in the Dismal Swamp that was used to move supplies from North Carolina to Virginia without using the main roads. The Union knew the swamp was there. They didn't know there was a road through it. Confederate wagons would disappear into the swamp on one side and emerge on the other side 2 days later. It wasn't until after the war that Union forces found the road. Both sides used enslaved labor and conscripted civilians to build roads. The Confederacy, especially, relied on enslaved men for road construction. They'd be brought in, and often in chains and forced to cut and lay logs in swamps that were breeding grounds for malaria, dysentery, and yellow fever. There are no good records of how many died. There are records of roads being built. The men who built them are mostly unnamed. The work was lethal. You're in a swamp in Virginia in July, 100-degree heat, humidity so thick you can't breathe, water up to your waist. You're cutting trees with an axe, dragging logs that weigh 300 pounds, laying them in mud while guards with rifles watch to make sure you don't stop working. If you collapse, you're left where you fall. The Union used contraband labor. Formerly enslaved people who had escaped to Union lines would be put to work building roads. They were paid technically, though the pay was often withheld or stolen. The work was brutal. You'd spend 12 hours a day in waist-deep water, moving logs that weighed hundreds of pounds, knowing that if you didn't finish, the army wouldn't advance and you wouldn't eat. There are accounts of road crews building through the night. They'd work by firelight, torches stuck into the mud, men cutting and dragging logs in the dark. The urgency was real. If the road wasn't finished by morning, the supply wagons couldn't get through. If the supply wagons couldn't get through, the army at the front would run out of ammunition and food. Speed was everything. A crew that could lay 100 yards of road per day in peacetime would be expected to lay a quarter-mile per day in wartime. They did it by cutting corners. Logs didn't have to be uniform. They didn't have to be straight. They just had to be logs. You'd use whatever trees were nearby. You'd lay them crooked if you had to. The road would be rough, but it would work. After the war, most of these roads were abandoned. The military had no reason to maintain them. Civilians didn't use them because they went through swamps where nobody lived. They rotted in place, but the technique survived. Corduroy roads were used in the logging industry, in mining, and in frontier settlement for another 50 years. In the timber camps of Michigan and Wisconsin in the 1880s and 1890s, loggers built corduroy roads to move cut timber out of the forest. These roads were temporary. They'd last one season, maybe two, then be abandoned when the timber was gone. But while they existed, they were essential. Without them, you couldn't move logs out of the forest. And if you couldn't move logs, there was no point in cutting them. Corduroy roads allowed the logging industry to expand into wetlands that would have otherwise been inaccessible. The timber boom of the late 1800s was built in part on log roads. Hit subscribe if you want to see more about the infrastructure that built America. Section 4, The Ride and the End, Immersion. Now imagine you're in a wagon. The driver tells you the road ahead is corduroy. You've heard about it. You think you know what to expect? You don't. The first log hits. The wagon lurches up, then slams down, then up again, then down. Every log is a jolt. Every gap between logs is a drop. The ride is violent. Your teeth clatter. Your spine compresses. If you're standing, you fall. If you're sitting, you bounce. If you try to hold on to something, your hands go numb from the vibration. A traveler in 1835 described it like this: "The motion is that of a trotting horse, but with none of the rhythm. You are thrown forward, then back, then sideways, then forward again. It is impossible to sleep. It is difficult to think. After an hour, your entire body aches." Another account from a woman crossing a corduroy road in North Carolina in 1842. "I believed we would be shaken to pieces. Every bone in my body hurt. My head ached. I became nauseous from the constant motion. When we finally reached solid ground, I could barely stand. The noise is deafening. Wooden wheels on wooden logs. A constant rumble, crack, thud. The wagon creaks. The logs groan under the weight. Sometimes a log breaks. You hear the snap, then the wagon drops, then the driver yells, and the horses lunge to pull you out of the hole. If you're lucky, the log breaks cleanly and the wagon just drops a few inches. If you're unlucky, the log splits lengthwise, catches the wheel, and flips the wagon. There are accounts of wagons overturning on corduroy roads, spilling cargo, injuring passengers, killing horses. The speed is slow. A horse can trot on a dirt road at 5 or 6 miles per hour. On a corduroy road, you're lucky to make 2 miles per hour. Any faster and the wagon starts to break apart. The wheels crack, the axles bend, the frame splits. Horses hated corduroy roads. A horse pulling a wagon over firm ground could do it all day without issue. A horse pulling a wagon over corduroy would be exhausted in a few hours. The constant jarring, the uneven surface, the gaps between logs, it all put stress on their legs and joints. Horses would go lame, tendons would tear, hooves would crack. There are accounts of horses finishing a corduroy crossing and having to be put down the next day because they couldn't walk. There are accounts of horses refusing to cross corduroy roads. They'd stop at the edge, plant their hooves, and refuse to move. The driver would whip them, yell at them, and they still wouldn't go. They knew. They'd done it before, and they didn't want to do it again. For riders, the toll was physical. Wagon springs helped, but not much. The best you could do was pack your wagon with hay or blankets and try to cushion the ride. Even then, a 10-mile trip over corduroy could leave you bruised and sick. There are medical accounts from the 1800s of travelers developing back problems, joint pain, and internal injuries from corduroy crossings. But the roads worked. They allowed travel across terrain that was otherwise impassable. A corduroy road through a swamp might be miserable to cross, but it was better than drowning in the swamp itself. It was better than losing your wagon, your cargo, your horses, and possibly your life. For freight haulers, corduroy roads were a necessary evil. You couldn't avoid them. If you wanted to move goods between cities, you had to cross them. So you did. You loaded your wagon, hitched your horses, and you crossed. And when you got to the other side, you checked your wagon for damage, checked your horses for injuries, and kept moving. Toll roads made it worse. Some corduroy roads were privately owned and operated. You'd have to pay a toll to use them, and the toll wasn't small. In some places, it cost as much to cross a 5-mile corduroy road as it did to transport your goods 100 miles on a decent road. But you paid it, because there was no other option. Maintenance was constant. A corduroy road needed to be inspected and repaired regularly. Logs would rot, break, or shift. Gaps would open up. If the road wasn't maintained, it became unusable. Toll road companies employed crews whose job was to walk the road, identify bad logs, and replace them. On a 10-mile road, they might replace 50 logs per week. By the 1870s, new technology started to replace corduroy roads. Macadam roads, made of crushed stone and gravel, were smoother and lasted longer. They required drainage, which meant they couldn't be built in swamps, but in areas with firm ground, they were far superior. The technique was developed by John Macadam in Scotland in the early 1800s. Instead of building a road on top of the ground, you'd excavate down to firm soil, build up layers of crushed stone, and compact it into a hard surface. The result was a road that was smooth, fast, and nearly indestructible compared to wood. Macadam roads spread across America in the 1870s and 1880s. They were expensive to build, but they lasted decades instead of years. Wagons could travel at speed without shaking apart. Horses could pull heavier loads with less effort. Then came asphalt. In the 1890s and early 1900s, asphalt roads began to spread. They were smooth, fast, and nearly indestructible compared to wood. Asphalt could be laid over almost any surface. It sealed out water, which meant it didn't rot. It didn't crack like stone. It didn't wear out like dirt. Corduroy roads fell out of use. By 1920, they were mostly gone. The swamps they crossed had been drained. The routes they pioneered had been paved. The technique that had allowed America to expand for 200 years was obsolete. But they didn't disappear entirely. In remote areas, especially in the logging industry, corduroy roads continued to be built into the 1940s. Logging companies would lay temporary log roads to move equipment into forests, then abandon the roads when the timber was cut. Some of those roads are still there, rotting in place, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. In Alaska and northern Canada, corduroy roads were still being built in the 1950s and 1960s in areas where permafrost made traditional road construction impossible. The logs would be laid on top of the frozen ground, actually providing a surface that would last through the brief summer thaw. Archaeologists and historians have found remarkably well-preserved sections of corduroy roads in bogs and swamps across North America. Because the logs were submerged in anaerobic mud, they didn't rot. They're still there exactly as they were laid, sometimes over 150 years ago. In Wisconsin, a section of corduroy road from the 1850s was discovered during a highway construction project. The logs were still solid, still in alignment. When they pulled them out, you could see the axe marks where they'd been trimmed. You could see the notches where they'd been fitted together. The wood was black, stained by centuries in the mud, but it was intact. In North Carolina, a Civil War-era corduroy road was found buried in the Dismal Swamp. The logs had been laid in 1862. When they were excavated in 2003, they looked like they'd been placed a few years earlier. The wood was black but intact. The structure was still sound. In Michigan, a bog near Traverse City revealed a corduroy road that was carbon dated to the 1830s. It was one of the first roads built in that part of the state. The logs were white pine, perfectly preserved, still showing the marks from the tools that had shaped them. These roads tell a story. They're a record of the labor, the ingenuity, and the desperation of a country trying to move forward across terrain that didn't want to be crossed. Section 5, closing thousands of miles of roads built from trees, laid by men whose names we don't know, across swamps that no longer exist because we drain them. To connect places that are now connected by highways we take for granted, the routes they created, the roads they laid, became the highways we drive today. Interstate 95, for much of its length through the Carolinas, follows the same route as the old corduroy roads that cross the Dismal Swamp. You're driving 70 miles an hour on asphalt, and 10 feet below you, there are logs from 1840. U.S. Route 20, which runs from Boston to Oregon, follows sections of old corduroy road through upstate New York. The routes were proven by wagons in the 1700s, improved with logs in the 1800s, paved with stone in the early 1900s, and finally covered with asphalt. But the route is the same. We forget how hard it was. We forget that there was a time when crossing a swamp meant cutting down a forest and laying it across the mud. We forget that the price of that crossing was paid in labor we didn't record, by men we didn't name, using a technology so simple it seems almost primitive. But it worked. And because it worked, the country moved forward. The corduroy road was never elegant, it was never smooth, it was never comfortable, but it was a solution to a problem that had no other answer. When the ground wouldn't hold a wagon, when the swamp was too deep to drain, when there was no way around, you built a road from trees. And for 200 years, that was enough. The men who built these roads were laborers, enslaved people, soldiers, convicts, and immigrants. They worked in conditions that would be illegal today. They died from disease, exhaustion, and accidents. Most of them were never paid what they were owed. Most of them were never thanked. But the roads they built opened the frontier. They connected cities, they moved armies, they made trade possible. They allowed settlements to survive in places that should have been uninhabitable. The debt we owe them is one we can never repay, because we don't even remember who they were. So the next time you drive through North Carolina or Virginia or Michigan or Wisconsin and you see a swamp next to the highway, think about what it took to cross that swamp in 1840. Think about the men standing in the water, cutting trees, dragging logs, building a road that would last just long enough for the next wagon to pass. Think about the horses that died pulling those wagons across roads made of wood. Think about the toll it took on bodies, on animals, on families who lost everything when their wagon tipped over in a swamp, because a log broke. And then think about the fact that we did it anyway, because the swamp was there and we needed to cross it, and the only tool we had was wood. That's the story of the corduroy road, a forgotten technology that built a nation.